So now that the coronavirus has us all stuck inside with our spouses and our kids 24/7, what are you supposed to do? I'm Karen Covey. I'm a divorce advisor, attorney, mediator, and coach. And today I want us to talk about what everybody is talking about, and that is the whole coronavirus crisis. Now, we're not going to talk about the health, the ins and outs of the health crisis and what it means and what to do. There are people who are way more qualified than me, and they've got all of that covered. But what they're not talking about is the day-to-day reality of how you live with your spouse 24/7 when your kids are home and you're supposed to be homeschooling and you may be working remotely from work and you've got this economic crisis and a health crisis all going on at the same time. How do you deal with that? Well, we're going to talk about a couple of different things that you can do. But the first thing you have to do is distinguish where your marriage is at and where you were at before this crisis. If you were in a good place and your marriage was solid and you and your spouse got along, that's one situation. Even in the best of marriages, though, with the economic crisis, with all the health stuff that's going on, with the stress of everything that's going on in the world today, that puts a stress on your marriage. So even in the best case scenario, you could probably use some tips about how to manage the situation so that you don't end up strangling your spouse. On the other hand, if you weren't in a good situation before this all started and your marriage was rocky and now you're stuck living in the same space with your spouse 24/7, that's a whole different discussion. You've got a whole extra level of stress that you now have to deal with. And if that's the situation that you find yourself in, the first thing that you want to do is see if you can have a conversation with your spouse about maintaining the status quo. In other words, talking to your spouse and saying, look, I don't like this any more than you do. This is not a good situation for anybody. But can we just put a pause on whatever our issues were and create some kind of normal, peaceful level of existence for now? Doesn't have to be forever. Doesn't mean you have to go to marriage counseling. If you want to do that, that's fine, but you don't need to do that right now. You just need to get through this crisis. And if your spouse is open to that conversation and willing to work with you, awesome. You got it. That's a great first step. If your spouse isn't willing to work with you, or if you're fighting so badly that you can't even have that conversation, then your only options are to deal with yourself and your kids. Pay attention to what you can control that, work on that, and let the rest go. Otherwise, you're going to make yourself a complete crazy person. So, that having been said, the tips that we're going to talk about apply to both situations. They apply to any marriage. But how you apply them and how well they work depends on whether you were in a good place to begin with or a not so good place to begin with. So what's the first tip? The first tip is to create structure. Now, I'm going to say straight up, right up front, this is artificial. I mean, it's not the same kind of structure that you had before, but before all this craziness hit, you got up at a certain time in the morning, you made breakfast, you took your kids to school, you went to work, you picked your kids up, there was a flow to your day, a structure to your day. Now that's all gone, or it's all different, right? So you need to create a structure for yourself and your kids. I mean, and if your spouse will go along, awesome, that's fabulous. But if he or she wants to stay in their pajamas until noon and then live in sweats and never take a shower, it's kind of disgusting, but you can't change that. And fighting about it right now might not be your best option. But what you can do is you can say, okay, I'm going to get up at this time, do this at that time, have lunch is going to be at this time, dinner is going to be at this time, and you set a structure to your day. That's going to ground you and give you a little more sense of normalcy, and most importantly, give your kids some sense of normalcy, because don't forget, they're all upside down too right now. So the more structure you can give them, the better off everybody is going to be. That's step one. Step number two is to create a separate space for everybody. Now, again, this is going to be tricky depending on how many people are staying in your house and how big your house is, right? Or your home. So for some people, if you've got a place where each child can have their own room so they can do their computer online schooling from that space, you can have a space where you can work from home in your space, your spouse has the same thing, that's awesome. But if that doesn't exist, then you need to create spaces so that everybody has a little piece of the home that they can call their own. Well, how do you do that? One thing you can do is you can rearrange the furniture. You can set the couch up so that it divides what used to be one room, the living room, into two. You can, if you really wanted to, you could take a string or a rope and you could string it across a room and put a sheet over it. That will create an artificial barrier. Now, of course, you're going to hear through that, but it's at least a barrier that creates a separate sense, of a room, some sort of separate space for every person. And let's face it, it's not like you're going to have company, right? So it doesn't matter that you've got a sheet draped across your living room. Really, right now, if that's what you've got to do it. Another suggestion is if you're in that kind of situation so you can hear each other all the time, this might be a good time to invest in some sound canceling headphones, right? So that way, at least you can't hear everybody else around you, and you can think and you can work if you have to work. You can do your schooling, you can do whatever you need to do. So that's also going to be a wise investment. But the bottom line is create, if you can, a separate space for yourself and separate spaces for your kids so that everybody has a place that they can feel comfortable and relaxed and home. The next thing you need to do, though, is to set boundaries. And boundaries are more than those physical boundaries of space, right? Because you can make a separate space, you can set a schedule, but if nobody pays attention to it, what have you done, right? You accomplished exactly zero. So what you want to do is you want to set boundaries or rules for this is how we're going to live while we're in quarantine. And you can call a family meeting to do this. You can have a discussion with your spouse to do this. If your spouse isn't into it, then maybe you just talk to your kids about it. But you talk about maintaining people's boundaries, their privacy. When you're working. When they're in school, people don't interrupt each other. You figure out what the rules are going to be that work for your family. And then, here's the hard part, you enforce the rules. Now, it is not necessarily your job to enforce your spouse's rules, like, what he or she is doing. It's your job to enforce your own rules. So, for example, if you're working and the rule is that from this time to this time you're working and you don't want to be interrupted barring an emergency, and your spouse yells down from the bedroom, "Hey, honey, can you let the dog out?" The answer is no. You have boundaries and it's your job to enforce them, because if you don't, they're going to go out the window and nobody's going to pay any attention and you're going to be so frustrated and so upset, and it's really not worth it. So make the boundaries for yourself, make them for your kids, or help your kids make their own, help your kids enforce their own boundaries, and everybody is going to be a whole lot happier. So those are the first three things that you can do. What's the fourth? Pick your battles. Especially if you were in this situation where you were fighting with your spouse all the time before, now may not be the time to fight, because you're stuck together 24/7, and you've got to live with that awful feeling. You don't want you and your kids to always be walking on eggshells. It's uncomfortable. So even if some things that your spouse does get on your very last nerve, if you're just going crazy and you feel like screaming, control yourself and pick your battles. Ask yourself, is this worth it? Is whatever I'm arguing about now or upset about now, is it worth the fight? And is it worth living with the aftermath of the fight? Because you're stuck together. And I'm not saying that you should just let everything go, but you should let a lot go, because right now you've got enough things to worry about. So before you get into a fight, ask yourself whether it's worth it, and you're just going to have to suck it up a lot of the time, a lot more of the time than maybe what you were used to. Then the last tip that I want to talk to you about is something that they call in 12-step programs, keeping your own side of the street clean. Here's what I mean by that. It means that you pay attention to yourself. You take responsibility for yourself, and you do your best to control yourself and not to try to control everybody else, because you're not going to be able to do it, and it's going to make everybody crazy if you try. So you want to take responsibility for your own self, and that starts with your own health and well-being. If you don't feel good, you are not going to deal with this crisis in a good way. You're just not. I mean, you're human. Everybody's human. So you need to eat right. You need to exercise every single day. You need to do your best to get plenty of sleep. Do your best to get outside just for 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, a half an hour if you can. Go out on your balcony. Go out in your backyard. Take a walk while we can still take walks. Do something to get a little bit of fresh air. That's going to do a lot, not only for your physical health, but your mental health as well. And so you're going to feel better. And when you feel better, your bandwidth, your ability to handle other frustrations and uncertainties, which we're all getting bombarded with, it's going to be bigger. So for your kids' sake and your sake, you really want to take care of yourself. And I know as a woman, I can tell you that a lot of times we care about everybody else first. We put ourselves last on the list. But now is a time when you really need to say, no, I need to get enough sleep. I need to have half an hour for myself to meditate, to bring my stress level down, or to do some stress reduction exercises, or to do whatever it is that I need to do so that I can be the best person possible in my marriage, to my kids, as a mom, as a wife, during this time. And, you know, this is a crazy time, and it's full of uncertainty, and it's full of frustration, and everybody is afraid. But this time is going to pass. And you want to make sure that you get through this time, and that your kids get through this time in the least crazy way possible. So your goal is make this livable. Actually, if you can, make it a good experience. Make it a positive experience. Role model that ability for your kids. They'll be amazed, and someday you'll look back at this situation. It'll be one of those, yeah, I remember the time when, blah, 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 blah. That's what you want. You don't want to make this the absolute most miserable time in your life, and you don't want to strangle your spouse by the time it's all over. So hopefully some of these tips have given you some ideas. They've been helpful. If you want more, go to my website. I'm going to put a link below the video for an article where there's a lot more tips on how to get through the coronavirus crisis without strangling your spouse. In other words, how to manage your marriage in the best way possible in a time of crisis. Thanks for listening. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll talk to you again next time.